always nice to be here. I think my third time here to Tassie now. First time was the big family trip, and we did a big trip around Tassie, saw everything. The next time was just a quick one. My husband came for classes. I was lucky enough to join him. So yeah, third time. And this time I'm here by myself. He's actually in the Philippines. So we've sort of scattered, maybe neglected our kids. They did ask me before I left, what are we going to do for dinner? And I went, I don't know. Here's my bank card. So hopefully they're good. Hopefully they'll be able to tell me, yep, we've been eating. So yeah. And yes, Anson is correct. I'd forgotten about that, meeting you on the train. And he is correct that yes, we did clear the table, all of us doing our homework in the evenings. Thank you. So yes, a little bit about me. I have done a degree in sociology, and I sometimes get this look of what is sociology? What do you do, sort of thing. So I like to explain it that sociology is sort of like this. It's not psychology, because psychology we kind of want to know what people are thinking in their head, but sociology is much more group focused. So we want to know what people are thinking and why they're doing things, but it's also how's the group impacting you? How's that showing? Making you lean towards certain things in your decisions. And so for my PhD, I actually did abortion narratives, and I interviewed people who had had an abortion. And that was the focus of my my study then. I was well, how did you get to that place? What was the decision-making process? So what were the things that were happening around you, the thoughts that people had about what mothers should be like, etc., that created this situation where now you went and had an abortion. So yeah, and now I'm in public health, which is slightly different, and I'm in breast cancer research. I'm not a clinician again, and again, it's about screening participation. So what makes people go, and why they don't, because it's actually quite low of how many people will go for breast screening. So yeah, that's what I do as a sociologist. But while I was dabbling this is my undergrad, I did also do quite a lot of philosophy units. So when Pastor Wes asked me and he said, this is the topic, I was just yes, I love that. I love talking about this about truth. It's and postmodernism, that sort of thing. It does. I do enjoy it. So I hope you'll enjoy my talk tonight. I did call it discerning truth. It was initially what is truth, but I also sort of thought, no, we want a little bit more than that. So I changed it to discerning, because I thought we don't just want to know what it is, but we also want to discern. Like the video that Anson just put up, it's what's going on here? Why are people thinking that? We want to be able to discern what kind of, I'm calling them paradigms of truth, are they working out of, to be able to say things which to us seem quite crazy, right? So that, yes, we are going to try to get an answer to that, because with the video, it's quite unsettling actually when we get in situations like that where people don't want to be pinned down on, for instance, height. We go, yeah, but, yeah, or maybe we'll get pinned down on that, but we don't want to get pinned down on gender, right? And we get very unsettled about that, with that, particularly then what does it mean for our Christian faith? So, yes, I will move on. Did it work? Brilliant. Okay, so when I was asked to speak at this conference, I was actually in Albany. You might recognise this place. It's the Gap down in Albany on the south coast there. It's a lovely place. We do go there quite often when we are in Albany. You can see the massive big lookout there. You can stand there, look down into the sea, and it's actually quite mesmerising. You just look down and the water's just churning. It's always churning. And yeah, it's quite a nice spot. This is actually a really calm day. Some days, you do get wet on the platform. And actually, I have been in the car park, and it's been raining in the car park. It's been that rough when the water comes in. But what's interesting for me and intriguing about this place is that when you get there, first of all, you park your car, and then, of course, it's a dangerous place. People have died here. So there's lots and lots of instructions. Do this, don't do that, stay on the path, etc., right? Anyway, so as you're guided along, because you're following the instructions and listening and staying on the path, you come to this sign, right? And actually, while you're standing here even and looking at this sign, that whole area in front, it's a really, really big area. It's these huge concrete tiles. And if you look closely at them, some are got lines in and some are plain. But if you look closely, it's actually a map of the world, right? The whole big section of tiles, right? And so then you come to this and you go, okay, this is interesting. So we've got two stories here. We've got a Dreamtime story, and this one here is I don't know what I would categorise that as actually, but it explains about this massive collision that happened back 1,300 million years ago between Antarctica and Australia, right? I just went to the museum, Tasmanian Museum today. That is back in deep time. That's how long ago that happened, right? And it talks about the significance, and you can still see it in the rock formations, etc., right? And so then I always stand in, I always have a little moment of ponder, right? And I think, okay, so I've just got to think about what my thought process is here first, right? And I just find it really interesting that they just are. They're both there. There's no privilege of one over the other. There's no preference. You don't get led to think this one is more true than that one, right? There's no overarching explanation. They just are there. And so I think to myself, well, there's one missing, obviously, right? As a Christian, you go, well, where's the creation one, right? So I think, well, should we put it on the side? But then I always think, but then that's just another option. So that's not right, right? And so I think, well, maybe it should go above to say, well, this one's more important. And it's like, yeah, but then it's still saying that these are okay, right? Even though this one's, we're giving preference to the one, we're still going, but that's still okay as well. And I always in the end kind of go, maybe not. Maybe we just can't have the three together, right? And then there's another thing that I always think about this as well, and I always think, the only reason why it's possible to have a sign like this, two stories, completely different, presented as both being true, is because what I would say is correspondence truth has disappeared. We've traded off correspondence truth. And you're going to go, what is correspondence truth, or correspondence version of truth? It is a bit of a philosophical term. As I said, I have dabbled in philosophy. And I will explain it. We're going to get to it, and I'll explain it in depth. We have touched on it a couple of times actually in the speeches yesterday, but it wasn't called that then. All right, so just a quick outline. This is, did it go? Nope. There we go. Just a quick outline. We are going to talk to Pilate's question, which is, what is truth? His really famous question. That is kind of what started off my whole process of thinking about all of this. Going to talk briefly about objectivism and relativism, which is two different ways of seeing the world, but I'm actually going to want to drill down into that a little bit more and talk more about paradigms of truth. A paradigm basically is just like a framework, right? It's a box, really, that stuff belongs in, sort of a thing. You could call it a worldview, I suppose, as well, right? So a paradigm is really just what it is that you are thinking in, okay? So we will talk about that and then get to the question of, well, does it matter? Okay? All right, so here's the story of Pilate. And he said to Jesus, so you say that you are a king? And Jesus answered and he said, well, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate says to him, what is truth? After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. And that's from John 18. So some commentators, they will say that Pilate seems very, disillusioned in this story, a bit tired, a bit weary, like, all right, well, what is truth anyway, sort of a thing. And they say that there's reasons for this because he was in Jerusalem and in the region, and it was kind of like not really the most favourite place where the Roman officials wanted to be. It was kind of like a bit of a difficult place. There was a lot of unrest, and as a result it was also then categorised differently in the Roman system. They had to have soldiers that went there, as opposed to like a more peaceful province which would not require a soldier presence. And then because it had the soldier presence as well, then it was also directly underneath the emperor, so the people in Jerusalem could appeal directly to the emperor. And what they sort of thought that Jerusalem needed a firm, strong and wise hand. And it seems that Pilate had a firm hand for sure, but he may have lacked a wise hand, because he seemed to have very little time for the Jews, sort of a bit contemptuous of them. So for example, when he first came to Jerusalem in his first visit, he came in with his whole unit of soldiers. And apparently the Roman soldiers, they always would have like a standard, and then on the top of the standard was a bust of the emperor. And of course, the Jews didn't like this, right? So they asked them to remove it. But he was like, and normally they did when they came to Jerusalem, because they knew that this was a problem. So normally they would remove it, but Pilate was like, nope, we're not doing that. He's like, nope, we're not going to do that. And so the Jews, they followed him around the whole time that he was in Jerusalem, all the time going, can you remove it? Can you remove it? And otherwise, if they didn't actually say it, they would just have this sort of peaceful presence of protest, right? Anyway, in the end, he said, well, if you're going to do that, then, you have to stop pleading your case, and if you don't, then you're going to be killed. So they went, okay, fine, kill us. And of course, he couldn't really do that, right? Because that would not be very good for a ruler, and particularly a new one. And so he had to back down, and did back down as well, and had the standards removed while he was in Jerusalem. So this story just gives you a bit of a sense as to the relationship between Pilate and the Jews, that he was used to infuriating the Jews, so he didn't get on with them, but he was also obviously used to not winning, that the Jews would usually come out the better. And if they didn't like what he said, they could always just go straight to Rome as well, right? So he was in a bit of a difficult situation, I would say. And now he's faced with the Jews again, and they're causing trouble, and they want Jesus killed. He knows that Jesus is innocent, but he knows that the Jews want him killed. So to refuse the Jews, that would mean that they could just report him to the higher authorities, and then he would possibly be removed from office. But to acquiesce and do it would be killing an innocent man. So he knows that he's probably going to lose in this confrontation, right? So in this context, he has a conversation with Jesus, and, as we say, he asks him, well, what is truth, right? So maybe he was disillusioned and wearied, as the commentators suggest, but maybe he also thinks, well, what does it matter anyway? The Jews are going to win anyway. So now I think looking at this as well is that Jesus' answer, well, not to the what is truth, but the previous question is also quite interesting, because he doesn't affirm or deny that he's a king, and he agrees that Pilate says he's a king. And I always feel like he puts himself out of the whole equation. Doesn't answer it. He puts him outside of that dilemma of, are you a king or are you not? And what will that mean if he is a king? Because that's what the Jewish leaders were also getting hung up about, and they actually, were going to deny. Later on, we read in the story that they deny God and say, and we say, only got Caesar as king, right? But Jesus seems unconcerned about the whole dilemma, and I think that's because he says, I was born for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world. And it's a different purpose. It's not about being a king or not being a king in our system, because he is king of the world, obviously. But it's to bear witness to the truth. And I always like to remember here that in John 1, which I do believe we read last night as well, that Jesus is from eternity. He was here before the beginning of the world. And John 1 says that he is the Word, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God. And so he was in the beginning with God. And that puts Jesus outside then of our usual frameworks, our usual understandings of the way the world is. And then he's the one who says, well, I have come to bear witness to the truth. And he says to Pilate, everyone who listens to me, everyone who is of the truth, listens to my voice. And I do want you to hold on to that thought of also that everyone who's of the truth listens to his voice, because we're going to come back to that later after I've talked about the different paradigms of truth and talk about that more. I think we're on this one. Yes. Okay. So how do you think that today people will answer Pilate's question of what is truth? I mean, we just saw the video, right, that Anson shared as well. They'd probably really find it difficult to be pinned down and not want to actually say what is truth, not come up with an answer at all for ourselves. Well, how would we answer it, right? How would you answer it? Would you give a tired sort of response like Pilate, saying, there's no real answer here, no real way of knowing what the truth is? That's the video that we just saw. or will you be able to have a firmer view? And I propose that there can be two different ways, depending on where you're going to sit here, as to how you can answer Pilate's question. And in the framework on the left, which is objectivism, this is sometimes called positivism or empiricism as well. It's another word for it. Basically, if you sit in that paradigm or framework of truth, then that's how you would understand then that truth is an objective truth. It's a thing out there which is separate from your own understanding of what is true. And this was mentioned, I think, twice last night as well, that it exists outside of yourself, right? It's out there. It is something that is true, that is out there. And we will talk more about that later. I'll go to the next one, okay? So when we talk about this kind of truth, often we'll use these sorts of words, like we'll say the truth or true truth. Often truth is capitalised if you are talking about this kind of truth. Francis Schaeffer called it the true truth. I think I've got that on there, yep. Sometimes real truth. Nancy Pearcey called it the total truth. So, yeah. As I said before, this is something that's out there. It can be found, it can be discovered, it can be uncovered, okay? It doesn't depend on who is doing the discovering or uncovering, okay? It will be the same, okay? So when you are operating in this kind of a framework, then you'll say things like, the truth speaks for itself, or facts speak for themselves. And this suggests that the truth itself isn't going to change. It's not going to be dependent on who is looking at it, who uncovered it, who discovered it, okay? It's independent of what we are saying about it, okay? This paradigm or way of thinking was fairly standard in the Western world for most of history. The title of this conference is Christian Truth in the Postmodern World, which indicates that now we're living in a postmodern world, which obviously before then was the modern period. And in that period, there were many developments and you had the rise of science, but this didn't get much pushback from Christians because both scientists and Christians sort of had a similar paradigm of truth. Christians didn't feel that science was a threat to their faith or undermining their beliefs because the idea that truth was out there to be uncovered. Okay, so the science experiments that people did or in the scientific explanations, it all kind of worked in the same way. We learnt a lot. It was this truth that was being uncovered, learning about the human body, for example, right? It was things that we were learning. It was a truth that was out there and we could learn about it, okay? But then after postmodernism, after modernism, we get the rise of postmodernism, which is what we're talking about tonight. And there we have what is often called relativism, and I'm sure many of you have heard that term. So now the world is like embracing this view that truth is not absolute. It's not an independent entity outside of there. It's not out there waiting to be discovered and uncovered. Okay, now it's relative. It's it's true dependent on your worldview or your perspective, and so you will say you can say things like that might be true for you, but this is true for me. If you're operating in this paradigm, then you really need to understand people's context before you're able to make any judgment on their behaviour. So, for example, what might be okay in one culture is not okay in another culture. But rather than judging somebody from another culture, you need to, because they don't have the same values as you, that you need to understand and explain their behaviour from their cultural perspective first, before you can make any judgment on the values that they are living by. I think I'm up to this one. So when people are working in this kind of paradigm, then you'll hear them say things like, that's your truth, but this is my truth, or that might be true for you. If you're operating in this kind of understanding, then you'll often see, won't want to talk about truth with a capital letter T, but it might give it a small letter. Often people claim that there's no absolute, and they would suggest actually that you're rather arrogant if you think that there is an absolute truth, because if you then do claim that you have an absolute truth and you can think of something that is out there independent of you and something that is true, that you're actually being arrogant and that you sort of have some sort of special claim over the knowledge of truth, which no one else has, right? And also, you're probably arrogant because you're probably claiming that you're right and they're wrong, which, as we saw in the video, they don't want to say that, right? Okay, the problem with dividing the truth and the understanding of truth just into these two paradigms, objectivism and relativism, is I think that they're slightly simplistic, and also you tend to come unstuck in the relativism one. Because even people who claim to be relative and that everything is relative, they will all still hold on to some things that are concrete. So I remember, for example, having discussions in class about relativism, and people would always get stuck when you get to people like Hitler, because they would always get really, really uncomfortable that maybe that might have been okay then, right? Because if everything's relative, then you can only judge behaviour in the context. Well, Hitler had created a world where he said that Jews couldn't exist and disabled people were no good, and homosexuals as well, that they couldn't exist in this world. So then within relativism, the logical conclusion would be that there's nothing wrong here, right? And he didn't do anything wrong. But even those people who want to push this idea of relativism, they kind of get unstuck here and back away from the claim and start going, maybe that's an exception, right? You got other examples which, now with our contemporary sort of concern about domestic violence, for example, like why do we spend so much energy and concern over domestic violence if everything's relative? Especially when this domestic violence is occurring in other countries, as a lot of it does as well, right? If there's different understandings on gender roles and what is okay and what's not okay in a society, why should we be concerned about this, right? If everything's relative and you can only judge it in that context, that's where you kind of get unstuck there, right? And people are very concerned about domestic violence. Rightly so. So I do think then that saying that postmodernism means that truth with a capital letter has fallen by the wayside and that there's no absolute truths anymore and everything's relative, I do think you still come into problems there. So instead, I'm going to propose and argue that, where's my thing? Here we go. All right, I'd like to just sort of now drill down more into the different paradigms, or objectivism and relativism, and come up with these, okay? You can see my correspondence version of truth is back up there as well. So, as I promised, I will explain it to you. So I think that these four are a bit more helpful, thinking about how people operate in truth. So you've got the correspondence version, you've got coherence, methodological, and pragmatic. I would say that coherence and pragmatic are firmly in the relativism paradigm. Correspondence version of truth is objectivism, definitely. And methodological would probably lean towards objectivism, possibly, but it could also be in the relativism one as well. And so I'm going to go through all of these, and we will also think about it from a Christian perspective. But I also think that generally people don't stick to one. They don't generally just, I'm definitely in the pragmatic, right? But it depends what they want to do as to which one that they will operate out of. All right, so first, correspondence version of truth. And this was spoken about last night as well, right? So this is when, as I've said already, when the truth is out there, it's separate from me. It doesn't exist in what I say. Me speaking about something doesn't make it true, right? Or I'm thinking about something. That's not what makes it true. What I'm talking about has to correspond with something out there, okay? There has to be a match. So, for example, we've got trees up here, okay, and this person thinking. So if I'm thinking about a tree, okay, there has to be something out there that is a tree, and that is what correspondence truth is all about, okay? That there is something out there that matches. Might be a specific tree, it might be category of tree that we are talking about. We could also get a bit more specific and say, talking about a Christmas tree, we can all think in our head what a Christmas tree is, right? But there is something out there that will match what I'm talking about, okay? So yeah, the crucial thing is here is that there's that static relationship, okay? And this we can easily understand this when we're talking about tangible objects like a tree or like, a chair or a table. What I'm talking about has to match something out there, okay? But it can be a bit more difficult to determine when we're talking about people's narratives or people's experience. And I always like to think that I'm glad I'm not a detective, because a detective, when they're investigating, say, a murder or something like that, then they have to work out what really happened. And, the saying, 10 eyewitnesses and 10 different versions of what happened, right? But somehow they got to do their job and they got to work out what happened. But I'm not a detective, I'm a social scientist. So I deal with people's narratives and experiences in my research. Traditionally, social scientists actually did follow the hard sciences a bit more. Hard sciences is things like, the chemistry, etc., etc. When you think of a researcher in their white gown and their goggles and doing experiments, that's what we would call the hard sciences. We tend to think of ourselves as more the soft sciences because we talk to people. We don't wear goggles either. They used to follow the hard sciences in trying to have an objective stance and claiming that they could get an objective stance. And the way that they did this was that linguistically, so the way they were writing about it, they would sort of keep themselves out of the picture. Trying to, sort of being this authoritative agent gazing down on a situation and determining what was happening, right? Now that kind of view is out of fashion. And now people like to say that nobody has a God view of the situation. And I just find it really interesting that they actually call it a God view, that nobody has a God view. So instead now, social scientists, they will say, no one has that God view, and so you've really got to be aware and upfront about your personal perspective, your worldview, your socioeconomic position, your gender, your age, etc. All of these things which will affect what you're seeing. So, does this mean the death of correspondence truth, or the truth, as we've said before, all right? That we no longer believe that a person's stories has to match something out there, that there's a truth out there, and I don't think so. And anyway, not for me. Maybe others will say so, but I don't, because the way that I conceive it is that there is a reality out there. There is an event, there is an experience that really happened, but I, as a person, can only hear that one person's story about what happened. And because it's an experience, it's very difficult to fact check, as we heard that word tonight as well. But that there is someone with a God view, but that is God, right? And he is always aware and always watching and always knows the truth. Okay, our next one, coherence. So this is called the coherence version of truth, and it means that what you say or what you believe needs to be internally coherent. Coherent means that it makes sense altogether, okay? So it needs to fit together, needs to make sense as a whole. There's an element of this kind of truth that can be used by detectives when they're trying to puzzle something out, because they will ask those questions about, like, does it make sense together? And that might be how they will catch someone out and find out what happened when somebody is telling lies. They will often, this version of truth is often used in the context of religions, like, a religion has to make sense within itself, and maybe then that will make it true. So, for example, is Hinduism internally coherent? Does it make sense as a whole system of beliefs, or are there inconsistencies in there? Islam, Christianity, are they internally coherent? And if you Google this question, it will tell you actually that all of them are inconsistent. And Hinduism actually is quite honest about these inconsistencies, and they claim that, well, that's because they're such an old religion, so they've had to grow over time and form new ideas about things, and they're also quite like, well, this shows how tolerant we are, right? Very modern, I suppose. Inconsistencies are also reported for Islam and Christianity as well. But then when you look at who is reporting these inconsistencies, I always find that quite interesting, because the one reporting inconsistencies for Islam works for the Institute for the Secularization of the Islamic Society. And the page of inconsistencies in Christianity is on the American Atheist webpage. And I just find it really interesting that it's like, why are they the ones who have stepped outside then now going, you're inconsistent? And I just kind of think, well, what have they done with truth here? What the box, the framework, the paradigm of truth? Have they traded something off here in order to be able to say, nah, you're inconsistent and that makes you not true? Next. How do I get to the next one? Oh, there we go. Beautiful. All right, so methodological. Where did my page go? Oh, I've lost it. What number slide is this? Does it say? 13. It is. Okay, there we go. So this is when people will put a lot of stake on your methods, okay? And the method by which you came to show that whatever you are claiming, your truth, okay? Could be the scientific method, like in the first one. I talked about the scientists doing the experiments in their white coats and goggles, okay? The methods that you follow will produce certain outcomes, okay? So it can be quite important. Then we have the thinking man, the iconic thinking man in the middle there. So this would be like the process, the thought process that you've followed to come to a particular conclusion, right? And people want to be able to examine your thought process to see whether it upholds their idea of what should be happening, whether that will support or undermine your conclusions. And the third one is a detective, who is also working towards a solution of proving a guilty or innocence. The methods, as well as the facts, will probably be scrutinised in court, and you probably know examples of where things get thrown out on a technicality, right? So here, in this framework, the how is just as important as the what of your truth claim. Okay, it's about the process, how you came to the conclusion, or how you came to that conclusion, and that's what will give it a status of being true or not. And what I've found is that if someone doesn't like your conclusions, they'll go back to your methods and they will attack your methods. Okay, so this happens in research. You want to put out an article for publication, and you always get a reviewer. If they don't like what you're saying, they'll go to your methods and go, you didn't quite do it right here and there, or whatever it might be. I think as well that if you have to do some sort of a review in an appeal process, you'll get the evidence, you'll gather it all together, you'll look at it, maybe you'll talk to this person or that person or whatever it might be to get extra information, and then you'll come to a conclusion. Then you go to the appellant and you'll say, this is our conclusion. And they'll say, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, we did this and this and this, we talked to so-and-so, this sort of thing. And then they'll kind of go, well, I think that's crazy because you didn't talk to so-and-so. You didn't look at that, right? And so then they'll attack your methods because they don't like your conclusion. But I think that, I think that consistories probably get this a lot when they got to do appeals. And I think it comes down to your framework, your methodological framework here. But I really want to ask the question of, well, is it really your method that makes something true? Is it possible to come to a wrong conclusion if you have the right method, and vice versa? Is it possible to use a different method and come to a similar conclusion, or the right conclusion, same conclusion, right? And I think that the answers here are yes, which means that it cannot be the method that determines whether something is true or not. And pragmatic version of truth. I actually really quite like this one. I find it really fascinating because this framework, it's really fascinating when you see this one in action, okay? Because this framework of truth, it means that something is true if you think it's useful for it to be true, right? And more often than not, power is involved here, right? So I'm sure you've heard the phrases of history is written by the victors. So pragmatic truth means that the more powerful people, they are the ones who are going to determine what is true, right? And then there'll be consequences from that, right? You will see that the government will make policies according to what they say is true, right? And those policies will have effect in our lives, lots of people's lives, right? So it's really quite interesting because it shapes history, whether it is true or not, right? So it's actually separate from the objective idea of truth. But if certain people will say it's true, then it is true and the effects become true, right? And I don't think this is a new paradigm of truth. Like when we talk about relativism, postmodernism, etc. It was actually first proposed by someone called Charles Peirce in the 1870s. So that's quite a long time ago. And also I think that before that the old kings and governments, they often operated within this paradigm, because if they said that you did something wrong, well, Pilate, for example, he could have said that Jesus was not innocent and therefore he has to die, right? And people did die because of a king said A or B. As an example, in the bottom one here, I don't know if you've ever watched Anna and the King. There's a part in there which I always think makes me giggle, because Anna came to Thailand and she wanted to, she had been promised a house of her own, but when she got there, she was just put in the harem, I think, with all the rest of the other ladies. And she didn't really want that. She wanted to have a house of her own so that she could live there with her son, etc., right? So she goes to the king and she says, yeah, but you promised. And she takes out this letter that he had sent her, that he had written, and said, look, you said a letter, you sent me a letter and you said it would be a brick house and blah, blah, blah. And he interrupts and he goes, the king will remember. In other words, it doesn't matter what that letter says. It doesn't matter what you remember, I remember, and I don't remember saying that you were going to get a house. Therefore, there will be no house. All right? So what I remember is what's true. And then that's the effect. That's what's going to happen. Okay? The top one is a more recent example, and it's closer to home, especially for myself. These two people are professors who were at the University of WA when I was there. Frida Fosdar on the left and Martin Forsey on the right, sociology professors. But I've had them both as teachers, and they were part of the sociology community when I was doing my PhD. About halfway my second year of doing PhD, the head of school decided that actually she was going to totally restructure social sciences, and she was going to get rid of the sociology department and get rid of all the lecturers. Okay, it was a very quick, sudden, she didn't discuss it with anybody. The justification for this shutdown was that she'd gone to a data set and she'd looked at enrolments, she had looked at student numbers, she'd looked at the numbers of completions and decided that, it was untenable, it was too low, right? Obviously, we weren't so happy about that. And it actually caused quite a fuss. The lecturers really pushed back and they argued that they hadn't used the data correctly. They hadn't used the correct data even. They were skipping, missing data, etc., right? And if you had all of the data, it would actually come up with a different picture that sociology actually was doing quite well, also compared to the other disciplines within social sciences. Anyway, eventually Martin Forsey, he went to the Fair Work Commission and he put in a complaint. So this photo is the two of them leaving their hearing from the Fair Work Commission. And then we waited for 6 weeks or so before they came out with an outcome. And the outcome was as follows. The accuracy of the data is irrelevant. UWA had not broken the law in disbanding sociology and making the lecturers redundant. So that was that. Pragmatic truth, right there. The accuracy of the data is irrelevant. So they could have actually just said anything they wanted, really, right? So it all went ahead. The powers that be, they had determined this and this and this was the picture, so this was going to be the outcome. Didn't matter whether it was a true picture or not, that was going to be the outcome. And the outcome was that the lecturers all lost their job except one, and all the PhD candidates, including me, we lost our supervisors. So in both of these stories, you'll see the element of power. right? It's those who can make the decision that call the shots, right? They are the ones then who paint the picture of the way it is and the way it will be, and then the outcomes of that just flow on, okay? And the claims become true because the power imbalance means that the outcome's going to happen anyway. And this is my next one. Yeah. So those are the 4 paradigms, which I find quite useful. I think they're a bit more nuanced than just talking about objectivism or relativism. Some of them are actually, really quite old. And going back to Pilate and Jesus, I think at least Pilate was actually honest. He was actually being honest when he said, I don't find any wrong in Jesus, right? He didn't make up a story that Jesus was some criminal and say, yep, and then that's the true story, right? Instead, I guess we can say that maybe now he was just unjust, right? And maybe a weak ruler who was afraid of the Jews because he knowingly condemned an innocent man to death and he knew he was innocent, but at least he didn't pretend otherwise, did he? All right? But for tonight, I think that this is really an important question of, does it matter? Does it matter what paradigm of truth are you going to operate out of? Does it matter if you go off, in this instance, it's quite pragmatic to believe such and such is true, right? And I think as well that thinking about the big picture then as well is that I like to think what happens when you trade off truth. So for instance, the correspondence version of truth, and it was said last night twice, I think by both speakers, that there is a truth out there that is objective. But if we're going to trade that off, what happens, right? And what happens as Christians? Before we answer that, I do want to just pose another question to you. And if we think of the last 3, so pragmatic, methodological, and coherence version of truth, the question there, and an important observation to be made, is that who has the authority there to determine what's true? And I think that's what it boils down to, because I think that there, if you're operating in that paradigm of truth, you're saying, I'm the authority. I'm going to decide whether, for instance, your methods are correct, or I'm going to decide whether your story is coherent or your religion is coherent, and I'm going to decide whether it's useful for me to believe that such and such is true, right? You're the one, you're the group of people or the individual, you're saying, I've got the authority to decide this, right? And I think that's really the point that we've got to make there. And contrast that too, if we go back to the story of Jesus here, Jesus and Pilate, okay? And Jesus says here that he's come to bear witness to the truth. And what I like here is that it says he has come, all right? And it means that he came from elsewhere, right? And we know that. We've discussed it at the beginning. He comes from eternity. He was here at the beginning of the world. Now he's standing in front of Pilate. And he steps outside of these ways of thinking about truth and says that he's come to bear witness of the truth. And he can do that because he is God and he's existed before the beginning of the world, right? And so as a result, he's also bigger than the world. And whereas none of us can claim that, we can only ever see one piece, our tiny little piece, okay? And I do think, going back to objectivism and relativism, I do think that objectivism sometimes forgets that, where you want to claim that you can see everything, but we can't. Only God can do that, right? But then as a result of that, because Jesus is God, if he says that something is true, and he used this term quite a few times when he was speaking with his disciples and said, truly, truly, or whatever, then we can trust him on that, okay? We should be able to take him at his word there. And the same thought is found here in Philippians 2, where it says that Jesus was in the form of God. He did not account equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And so with Jesus, there was that before and after. Before he was with God, his very existence was God, and he was in heaven. Then Christmas happened, and he took on the form of a human being. Right? He emptied himself. Before he lived in majesty in heaven, and then he took on human form. he was born, he was raised, he had a ministry, and now he's standing before Pilate in our, not in this text, but in the other one. So none of us can come claim that before and after, right? We were born and conceived and born, right? And our birth is not a transition from something else, but it's a beginning. Whereas with Jesus, it was a transition. And I think it's significant here because it means that Jesus existed and continues to exist outside of our earthly dimensions and earthly restrictions. And it means that that Jesus as God is the only one who's able to claim the God view that we talked about earlier. And he's the only one then who will tell us how things really are. And that means that if Jesus tells us about a heaven and a hell, for example, then there must be a place that corresponds with what he is describing as heaven and hell, going back to our correspondence version of truth, that objective truth, that there is a truth out there, right? If Jesus says that there's heaven, there is a heaven. If he says there's hell, there is a hell, right? If he says that he had to die on the cross to pay for our sins, well, then he had to die on a real cross to pay for our sins. And it means that our sins must have offended a real God, right? A person... So there must be a God then who corresponds with what the Bible describes as God, right? That the God will exist, and our sins must be real transgressions. So this isn't just then some narrative which is like a handy story to keep everybody in line, or to comfort ourselves when someone dies that they're going to be in a nicer place, right? It's not just a handy nice story, but it's the objective truth. And I think we can, and I guess what I'm saying is that to take it from Jesus, that if he says that, because he came from elsewhere and he is outside of our usual ways of thinking about truth, that we can take him on his word. This one here. And so that's why I say we can have more certainty, because Jesus also said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Just reinforcing that he's God and he's from eternity. That's when he says, I am there. And he will tell us how things really are. So he's also the embodiment of truth, standing there in front of Pilate. And it is quite ironic that Pilate actually asks somebody who embodies truth completely, what is truth. But he can say that. Now we don't have Jesus physically standing in front of us like Pilate, but we do have the word. And I think the question that we're faced with now as Christians in a postmodern world is, are we going to accept the word as it claims to be? That John 1 says that the word was with God and the word was God, the word was there at the beginning of the world and the word created the world, right? Are we going to accept that as truth? Jesus also said to Pilate, everyone whose truth listens to my voice. So I think that means that if you're a Christian, if you belong to Jesus, you need to take his word as it really is. And you need to hold on to so much more than just a belief that Christian is like, makes sense, or that, you trusting on your own reasoning power, as a methodological paradigm of truth. Or in some sense, even worse, that if you want to be pragmatic about it, that it's nice. It's a nice story to keep us all in line. If we are of the truth, then we'll listen to Jesus' voice, and he says that he is truth. So the question really is just, will we take his word for it? So, yes, does it matter? And I would say, yes, it does matter, because if you're going to trade correspondence truth, if you're going to trade that idea that there is an objective reality out there and an objective truth, I think you're going to get into real difficulty. And then we will stop believing that heaven is a real place and hell is a real place. We'll think that Jesus is just a good story and that he's a good example for us. We'll see him as, but we have to see him as the real man who stood before Pilate as the embodiment of truth. So I guess I think that we will be in a dangerous position if we give up on that and then take our cues from the world around us. So with that, I do want to just leave you with this thought, that your paradigm of truth matters, and maybe even for eternity. So thank you.